The gunshot cracked through the dusty alley before Grace Gardner even had time to scream. And suddenly, one of the men threatening her crumpled to the ground like a sack of flour, while his companions scattered into the shadows like the cowards they truly were. Grace pressed herself against the weathered brick wall of the general store, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst straight through her chest. The late afternoon sun of June 1877 cast long shadows across Green River, Wyoming, and in one of those shadows stood her unlikely savior. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dust coating his dark clothing and a smoking revolver still raised in his steady hand. His hat sat low over his eyes, but she could see the firm set of his jaw and the way his body remained coiled like a spring, ready for the two remaining threats to return. They did not return. The second man, her rescuer, had shot lay motionless several feet away, and Grace realized with a sickening lurch that she had nearly become another victim of the lawless violence that plagued these frontier towns. She had only been trying to take a shortcut back to her boarding house after finishing her shift at the schoolhouse, where she taught the children of miners and ranchers their letters and numbers. "You hurt, miss." The cowboy's voice was deep and rough, like gravel tumbling in a creek bed, but there was genuine concern threading through it. Grace shook her head, not trusting her voice yet. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her skirts, trying to smooth the fabric that had gotten twisted during her struggle. She was 22 years old and had been teaching in Green River for nearly a year now, having come from Boston to make her own way in the world after her parents had tried to marry her off to a banker twice her age. She had thought herself brave for making that journey west, but now she felt like a foolish child who had wandered into a wolf's den. The cowboy holstered his weapon with practiced ease and took a few cautious steps toward her. Now that he was closer, Grace could see his face more clearly. He could not have been much older than 25, with strong features that spoke of long hours in the sun and wind. His eyes were a startling shade of blue, like the sky just after dawn, and they studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch for entirely different reasons than fear. "My name is Vincent Lawrence," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "I was riding through when I heard the commotion. Those men should not have cornered you like that." "Thank you," Grace finally managed, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. I do not know what would have happened if you had not come along when you did." Vincent's expression darkened. "I have a fair idea, and it's nothing a lady should have to think about." He glanced down at the two bodies sprawled in the dirt. "We should get the sheriff." "Can you walk?" Grace nodded, though her legs felt like water. She took a step forward and stumbled slightly. Vincent was there in an instant, his hand steady under her elbow, supporting her weight without making her feel weak. His touch was warm even through the fabric of her sleeve, and Grace found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her. They made their way out of the alley and onto Main Street, where curious townspeople were already gathering at the sound of gunshots. Grace recognized several of them: Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile, old Mr. Chen who ran the laundry, and the Reverend Thomas who had been kind enough to help her find her position at the school when she first arrived in Green River. Sheriff Hawkins came striding down the wooden boardwalk, his badge catching the sunlight. He was a grizzled man in his 50s who had seen more than his share of trouble in this growing railroad town. "What happened here?" Vincent explained the situation with calm, clear words while Grace tried to steady her breathing. Several men went to examine the bodies in the alley, and Grace heard them confirming what she already knew. 2 men were dead, shot clean through. The other 2 had vanished like smoke on the wind. "The Morrison brothers," Sheriff Hawkins said grimly after looking at the bodies. Drifters who have been causing trouble since they rolled into town 3 weeks ago. We have been trying to catch them doing something we could arrest them for, but they have been slippery. The other two were probably the Yates cousins. They run together." He looked at Grace with sympathy. "Miss Gardner, I am sorry this happened to you. You did the right thing getting help." "Mr. Lawrence saved me," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "If he had not been there, then we would be having a very different conversation," the sheriff interrupted gently. "But he was there and you are safe. That is what matters." He turned to Vincent. "You new to Green River, son?" "Just passing through," Vincent replied. "I have been working cattle drives up from Texas, but the last one finished in Cheyenne 2 weeks back. I was heading toward Montana, thinking I might find ranch work up there." "Well, you picked a good time to pass through." Sheriff Hawkins extended his hand, and Vincent shook it firmly. "The town owes you a debt. Miss Gardner here is one of our finest citizens. She teaches our children, and has done more for this community in 1 year than some folks do in a lifetime." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the praise. She was not accustomed to such public acknowledgement, having always believed that teaching was simply the work she was meant to do. She glanced at Vincent and found him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Respect, certainly, but something else too. Something that made her pulse quicken. The next hour passed in a blur of questions and statements. Grace had to recount what had happened several times, describing how the 4 men had followed her from the schoolhouse, making crude comments that she had tried to ignore. When she had ducked into the alley hoping to lose them, they had cornered her instead. She had been about to scream when Vincent appeared like an avenging angel, his gun blazing, by the time Sheriff Hawkins was satisfied with his investigation. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Grace felt exhausted, drained by the fear and shock of the afternoon. Vincent had stayed by her side through all of it, a quiet, steady presence that made her feel safer than she had since arriving in Wyoming. "Let me walk you home," Vincent said, as the crowd finally began to disperse. It was not really a question, and Grace found she did not want to refuse. "Thank you," she said. "I am staying at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house just 2 streets over." They walked in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds the distant piano music from one of the saloons and the creaking of wagon wheels on the rutted dirt road. Grace was acutely aware of Vincent beside her, the way he positioned himself between her and the street, the way his eyes scanned their surroundings as though expecting danger to leap out at any moment. "You said you were heading to Montana," Grace said finally, breaking the silence. She was not sure why the thought of him leaving made her chest feel tight, but it did. "That was the plan," Vincent replied, "but plans change sometimes. Will you stay in Green River?" The question tumbled out before Grace could stop it, and she immediately felt foolish. Why would he stay? He was a cowboy, a drifter, someone who lived by his own rules and followed the work wherever it took him. Men like that did not put down roots in small railroad towns. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and Grace thought perhaps she had overstepped. But then he said, "I might. I have been traveling for 5 years now, ever since my father's ranch in Texas went under after the war. Maybe it is time I found somewhere to settle, at least for a while. And Green River seems like as good a place as any." Grace felt something flutter in her chest, something hopeful and warm. "There is always work for good men here. The ranches around the area are always looking for experienced hands, and the railroad brings more business every month. What brought you here, Miss Gardner? You do not sound like you are from Wyoming." Grace smiled slightly. "Boston, originally. My parents wanted me to marry a man I could not stomach, so I applied for teaching positions as far from Massachusetts as I could find. Green River's school board was the first to offer me a contract. That took courage, Vincent said, and there was admiration in his voice. Leaving everything you knew to come out here alone. Or foolishness, Grace replied, thinking of how helpless she had been in that alley. I thought I was brave, but today showed me how vulnerable I really am. Vincent stopped walking and turned to face her. They were standing beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. What happened today was not your fault. Those men were predators looking for someone to hurt. You did nothing wrong. The conviction in his voice made Grace's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She had been holding herself together through sheer will, but his kindness threatened to undo her composure completely. I was so frightened, she whispered. I have never been so frightened in my life. I know, Vincent said gently, but you survived. You are stronger than you think, Miss Gardner. They resumed walking, and soon Grace found herself standing on the porch of Mrs. Crawford's boarding house. The building was neat and well-maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a sign advertising rooms for respectable ladies only. Grace had found refuge here when she first arrived, and Mrs. Crawford had become something of a friend and mentor. Thank you again, Mr. Lawrence, Grace said, turning to face him. I owe you my life. You owe me nothing, Vincent replied. Any decent man would have done the same. But you were the one who was there, Grace insisted. You were the one who acted when I needed help most. That means something. Vincent smiled, and it transformed his whole face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger, almost boyish. Then I am glad I was there at the right time. Grace hesitated, not wanting the evening to end despite everything that had happened. Will I see you again? I expect so, Vincent said. Green River is not that big a town, and if I am planning to stick around for a while, our paths are bound to cross. Grace watched him tip his hat and walk away into the gathering darkness, his spurs jingling softly with each step. She stood on the porch long after he had disappeared from view, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was still beating too fast. Mrs. Crawford found her there 10 minutes later, concern etched deep in her weathered face. The older woman had heard about the incident from one of the neighbors, and she fussed over Grace like a mother hen, insisting she drink hot tea with honey and sit by the fire even though the June evening was warm. That young man who saved you, Mrs. Crawford said as she poured the tea. Vincent Lawrence. I heard some of the men talking about him at the mercantile. They said he drew faster than lightning and did not hesitate for even a second. He was very brave, Grace said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. And handsome too, from what I hear, Mrs. Crawford added with a knowing look. Several of the young ladies in town have already been asking about him. Grace felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy, which was ridiculous. She had only just met Vincent Lawrence. She had no claim on him whatsoever. And yet the thought of other women vying for his attention made her stomach twist. I suppose they would be, Grace said, trying to keep her voice neutral. He seems like a good man. A good man who saved your life, Mrs. Crawford pointed out. That creates a bond whether you want it to or not. Do not be surprised if you find your thoughts turning to him in the days ahead. Grace could not deny that her thoughts were already full of Vincent Lawrence. She kept seeing his face in her mind, the way his blue eyes had blazed with righteous anger when he looked at the men who had threatened her, the gentleness in his touch when he had steadied her, the slight smile that had softened his features before he left. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that alley, feeling the rough hands grabbing at her, hearing the crude laughter of men who saw her as nothing more than prey. But then Vincent would appear in her memories like a guardian angel, and she would feel safe again, protected. The next morning, Grace forced herself to go about her normal routine. She dressed carefully in her simple cotton dress, pinned her dark hair into a neat bun, and walked to the schoolhouse with her chin held high. She would not let fear control her life. She would not give those men that power over her. The children greeted her with enthusiasm, and several of the older ones asked about the incident. News traveled fast in a town like Green River. Grace answered their questions honestly, but without dwelling on the frightening details. She used it as a teaching moment instead, talking about the importance of courage and kindness, of standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. At lunchtime, as the children were eating their meals outside under the shade of the schoolyard trees, Grace saw a familiar figure riding down the street. Her heart skipped as she recognized Vincent Lawrence atop a sturdy bay horse, his hat pulled low against the midday sun. He was heading in the direction of the Silver Creek Ranch, the largest cattle operation in the area. Grace wondered if he was seeking employment there. The ranch was owned by Douglas Montgomery, a tough but fair man who had built his operation up from nothing and now ran several thousand head of cattle across the open range. If Vincent was hired there, he would be staying in Green River for at least the rest of the season, possibly longer. The thought made Grace smile despite herself. She did not see Vincent again for 3 days, though she heard plenty about him. Apparently, he had indeed been hired at Silver Creek Ranch, and the other cowboys were impressed with his skills. He could rope and ride better than most men half again his age, and he had a way with difficult horses that bordered on magical. Douglas Montgomery himself had reportedly said that Vincent Lawrence was the best hand he had hired in years. Grace told herself she was being foolish, mooning over a man she had spent perhaps an hour with total. But she could not help scanning the streets whenever she walked through town, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. She replayed their conversation in her mind, analyzing every word, every look, trying to determine if he had felt even a fraction of the connection she had felt. On Saturday afternoon, as Grace was leaving the mercantile with her weekly supplies, she nearly collided with someone on the boardwalk. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and she looked up to find herself staring into Vincent's startlingly blue eyes. "Miss Gardner," he said, his voice warm with pleasure. "I was hoping I might run into you." "Mr. Lawrence," Grace replied, trying to control the flush she could feel creeping up her neck. "I heard you found work at Silver Creek Ranch." "I did. Mr. Montgomery is a good boss and the work is honest. I am bunking with the other hands for now, but it beats sleeping under the stars every night." He paused, seeming suddenly uncertain. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were doing all right after what happened." The concern in his voice made Grace's chest feel warm. "I am well, thank you. The first night was difficult, but I have not let fear keep me from my duties. The children need me, and I will not abandon them." "That is brave of you," Vincent said. "A lot of people would have left town after something like that." "I thought about it," Grace admitted. "But running away would not solve anything. Those men are gone now, and Sheriff Hawkins says the Yates cousins left town the same night. They are cowards, just like you said. They will not risk coming back." Vincent nodded approvingly. "Good. You are stronger than you give yourself credit for, Miss Gardner." They stood there for a moment, the bustle of Main Street flowing around them like water around stones in a stream. Grace was aware of curious glances from passers-by, but she found she did not care. Being near Vincent made her feel safe and alive in a way she had never experienced before. "I was wondering," Vincent said, and now he definitely looked uncertain, almost shy, "if you might allow me to call on you sometime. Properly, I mean. Maybe take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant or to the church social next Sunday." Grace's heart soared. "I would like that very much, Mr. Lawrence." "Vincent," he said with that transformative smile, Please call me Vincent. Then you must call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and the way he said her name made it sound like something precious. "It suits you." They made plans for Vincent to pick her up at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house the following Sunday after church services. He would be attending the service himself, he said, as Mr. Montgomery encouraged his ranch hands to maintain ties with the community. Grace found herself counting the hours until Sunday with an anticipation that made her feel like a giddy schoolgirl rather than a responsible teacher. Mrs. Crawford was delighted when Grace told her about the upcoming social. The older woman insisted on helping Grace choose her best dress, a soft blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs that brought out the green flecks in Grace's hazel eyes. She lent Grace a cameo brooch that had belonged to her own mother, and spent an hour helping Grace arrange her hair in a more elaborate style than she usually wore. Sunday morning dawned clear and beautiful, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers from the surrounding hills. Grace sat through Reverend Thomas's sermon in a state of nervous excitement, barely hearing a word he said. She kept sneaking glances toward the back of the church where the ranch hands typically sat, and every time she caught Vincent's eye, he would smile at her with such warmth that she felt it down to her toes. After the service, Vincent was waiting for her on the church steps, looking handsome in clean clothes with his dark hair neatly combed. He offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and Grace took it, feeling the solid strength of his muscles beneath the fabric of his jacket. The church social was held in a large tent behind the building, with tables laden with food that the townswomen had prepared. There was music from a fiddle and guitar, and children ran laughing between the adults while their parents chatted and enjoyed the rare moment of leisure. Grace introduced Vincent to several of her friends and colleagues, and she noticed how easily he fit in, how respectfully he treated everyone regardless of their station. They filled their plates with fried chicken, cornbread, baked beans, and fruit pie, then found a relatively quiet spot beneath a cottonwood tree to eat and talk. Grace learned that Vincent had grown up on his family's ranch in Texas, learning to ride and rope before he could read. His father had been a proud man who had lost everything in the years after the Civil War, when carpetbaggers and corrupt officials had seized property and imposed crushing taxes on former Confederate states. "He died when I was 20, Vincent said quietly, staring at his plate. "Worked himself to death trying to hold onto land that was already gone. My mother had passed 2 years before that from fever, and I had no siblings. So I sold what little was left and started drifting, taking work where I could find it." "I am so sorry," Grace said, touching his hand gently. "That must have been terribly difficult." Vincent turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. The simple gesture sent warmth spreading through Grace's whole body. "It was, but it taught me to be self-reliant, to not depend on anything permanent. I learned to make my home wherever I hung my hat." "And now," Grace asked softly, "are you still drifting, or have you found somewhere you might want to stay?" Vincent met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I think I might have found a reason to stay in one place for a while." They talked for hours as the afternoon sun tracked across the sky. Grace told him about growing up in Boston, about her love of books and learning, about her dreams of making a real difference in the lives of her students. Vincent listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own observations about the world he had seen during his travels. When the social finally began to wind down, Vincent walked Grace back to Mrs. Crawford's boarding house. They took the long way, strolling through the residential streets where neat houses with white picket fences stood in orderly rows. Children played in yards, and women tended to flower gardens, and it all felt so peaceful and normal that Grace could almost forget the violence that had brought her and Vincent together. "I had a wonderful time today," Grace said as they reached the boarding house porch. "Thank you for inviting me." "The pleasure was all mine," Vincent replied. He still held her hand and he squeezed it gently. "Grace, I know we have not known each other long, but I want you to know that I have never met anyone like you. You are brave and kind and beautiful, and I would very much like to continue courting you properly if you will allow it." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "I would like that very much, Vincent." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with old-fashioned gallantry. "Then I will call on you again soon. Maybe we could go riding next Saturday if you are comfortable with that. I know a beautiful meadow a few miles out of town where wildflowers grow so thick you cannot see the ground." "That sounds lovely," Grace agreed. True to his word, Vincent began courting Grace in earnest. He came to town every Saturday when he had time off from the ranch, and they would spend the afternoon together, sometimes riding out into the countryside, sometimes simply walking through Green River and talking. Grace learned that Vincent was thoughtful and intelligent despite his lack of formal education. He had taught himself to read using his mother's Bible and whatever newspapers he could find, and he had a natural curiosity about the world that matched her own. Vincent learned that Grace had a sharp wit and a stubborn streak that belied her gentle appearance. She had opinions about politics and social reform that shocked some of the more conservative townspeople, but Vincent found her passion admirable. She believed in equality and justice, in education as the great equalizer, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that every child in her classroom had the same opportunities regardless of their background. As summer deepened and the days grew long and hot, Grace found herself falling in love. It was not the dramatic, overwhelming passion she had read about in novels. Instead, it was a slow, steady warmth that grew with each conversation, each shared laugh, each comfortable silence. Vincent made her feel seen and valued in a way no one ever had before. He respected her mind as much as he admired her appearance, and he never tried to diminish her ambitions or tell her she should be content with less. For his part, Vincent found himself imagining a future he had long since given up on. He had spent 5 years telling himself that he was content with a wandering life, that he did not need roots or stability. But Grace made him want things he had not dared to want since his father's ranch had failed. She made him want a home, a family, a reason to plant seeds and wait for them to grow. In late July, Vincent asked Grace to accompany him to the annual Independence Day celebration that Green River held every year. The whole town turned out for the event, which featured races, contests, a huge picnic, and fireworks after dark. Grace wore her prettiest dress, a pale yellow cotton that made her skin glow, and Vincent could not take his eyes off her. They participated in the 3-legged race and came in second place, laughing so hard they could barely stand. They ate watermelon and corn on the cob and drank lemonade until they were stuffed. And when the fireworks began painting the night sky in brilliant colors, Vincent put his arm around Grace's shoulders and pulled her close. "Grace," he said, his voice low and serious despite the celebration happening around them, "I need to tell you something." Grace looked up at him, her face illuminated by the reflected glow of the fireworks. "What is it?" "I love you," Vincent said simply. "I know it has only been a couple of months, but I am certain I love you, Grace Gardner. You have made me believe in possibilities I thought were lost to me forever." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Vincent. I think I have loved you since the moment you appeared in that alley like a hero from a storybook." Vincent cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I am no hero, Grace. I am just a man who wants to spend the rest of his life making you happy." "Then kiss me," Grace whispered. Vincent did, and in that moment, with fireworks exploding overhead and the whole town celebrating around them, Grace felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Their courtship continued through the summer and into the fall. Vincent had proven himself such a valuable hand at Silver Creek Ranch that Douglas Montgomery offered him a permanent position as foreman, overseeing the other cowboys and managing the day-to-day operations. It was a significant promotion that came with better pay and a small cabin on the ranch property. Vincent accepted immediately, seeing it as a sign that he was finally ready to stop drifting and build a real life. In October, when the aspens on the surrounding hillsides turned gold and the air carried the first hint of winter, Vincent invited Grace to see his new cabin. It was modest but well built, with a stone fireplace, 2 rooms, and a porch that overlooked a small creek. Grace could immediately see its potential, how it could be transformed into a real home with curtains in the windows and rugs on the floors. "What do you think?" Vincent asked nervously as Grace explored the space. "I think it is perfect," Grace said honestly. "It just needs a woman's touch to make it complete." Vincent took her hands and pulled her close. "Grace, I know we have only been courting for 5 months, but I am not getting any younger, and I have never been more certain about anything in my life. Will you marry me? Will you make this cabin a home and let me spend the rest of my days loving you?" Grace's answer was immediate. "Yes. Yes, Vincent, I will marry you." They were wed in late November at the Green River Church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Grace wore a simple white dress that she and Mrs. Crawford had sewn together, with orange blossoms in her hair and the borrowed cameo at her throat. Vincent wore his best suit, and the expression on his face when he saw Grace walking down the aisle made several women in the congregation dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with great solemnity, speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. When Vincent and Grace exchanged their vows, their voices were steady and clear, full of conviction. And when Vincent kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the hotel, with food and drink and music that lasted late into the evening. Grace danced with her new husband, with Sheriff Hawkins, with Douglas Montgomery, and with many of the fathers of her students. Vincent was pulled aside by several of the ranch hands who wanted to offer their congratulations and advice, most of it humorous and slightly improper. When the evening finally wound down, Vincent carried Grace over the threshold of their cabin, both of them laughing and slightly giddy from champagne and happiness. He set her down gently in the middle of their front room, where a fire already crackled in the fireplace and candles cast a warm glow over everything. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawrence," Vincent said softly. "I like the sound of that," Grace replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Mrs. Lawrence." Grace Lawrence. Their wedding night was everything Grace had hoped for, and nothing like the vague, frightening descriptions she had heard from other women. Vincent was gentle and patient, treating her with reverence and care, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And Grace discovered that passion was not something to be feared but celebrated, a natural expression of the love they shared. In the months that followed, Grace and Vincent settled into married life with surprising ease. Grace continued teaching at the schoolhouse, though she had to endure good-natured teasing from her students about her new name. Vincent threw himself into his work as foreman, determined to prove that Douglas Montgomery's faith in him was well placed. They developed routines and rhythms, learning each other's habits and preferences. Grace discovered that Vincent was an early riser who liked his coffee strong and black, and that he had a tendency to work too hard if she did not remind him to rest. Vincent learned that Grace was most creative in the evenings, often staying up late to prepare lessons or read, and that she had a terrible sweet tooth that he loved to indulge whenever possible. Their first winter together was harsh, with heavy snows that sometimes kept Grace home from the schoolhouse for days at a time. But Grace did not mind. Those snowbound days gave her and Vincent precious time together, cuddled by the fire while the wind howled outside. They talked about everything and nothing, made love in the afternoon with the curtains drawn against the white world outside, and dreamed about the future they were building together. In the spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for a few weeks, having missed her monthly courses and felt slightly queasy in the mornings, but she waited to tell Vincent until she was certain. She chose a perfect moment, one evening when they were sitting on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Vincent," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach, "there is something I need to tell you." He looked at her with concern. "What is it? Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling wonderful," Grace assured him. "Better than wonderful, actually. Vincent, we are going to have a baby." The expression that crossed Vincent's face was one of pure joy mixed with wonder. "A baby? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I think the baby will come in late October or early November." Vincent pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly Grace could barely breathe. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby." Grace laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we are. Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Vincent said. "Grace, you have given me everything I thought I had lost. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. How could I be anything but happy?" They spent the evening making plans, discussing names and preparing for the changes a baby would bring. Vincent immediately became protective, insisting that Grace reduce her hours at the schoolhouse and rest more. Grace rolled her eyes at his hovering but secretly loved how much he cared. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. The children at school were fascinated when she finally began to show, asking endless questions about babies and birth that made Grace blush but which she answered as honestly as she could. Mrs. Crawford and the other women in town rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and promising to help when her time came. Vincent, meanwhile, became even more dedicated to his work, determined to provide the best life possible for his growing family. He and Douglas Montgomery began discussing the possibility of Vincent eventually buying some land of his own, building his own small ranch. It was a long-term goal, but Vincent liked having something to work toward, a legacy he could leave for his children. In late October, just as the leaves were beginning to turn, Grace went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that lasted through the night and into the next day. Vincent refused to leave her side despite the midwife's suggestion that he wait outside like most husbands did. He held Grace's hand through every contraction, wiped her face with cool cloths, and murmured encouragement when she was certain she could not go on. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that made everyone in the cabin smile with relief. The midwife cleaned him up and placed him in Grace's arms, and Grace looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature with overwhelming love. "He is perfect," she whispered. Vincent touched his son's downy head with one finger, his expression one of awe. "He is amazing. You are amazing, Grace. I have never seen anything braver than what you just did." They named him Daniel Vincent Lawrence, after Vincent's father. The baby had his father's blue eyes and what promised to be his mother's dark hair. He was healthy and strong, and from his first day, he had both his parents wrapped around his tiny fingers. The first months of parenthood were exhausting but joyful. Grace took a temporary leave from teaching to focus on caring for Daniel, while Vincent continued working at the ranch. But he made sure to spend every free moment with his family, often bringing Daniel to the porch in the evenings and talking to him about the ranch, the cattle, and the land as though the baby could understand every word. When Daniel was 6 months old, Grace returned to teaching part-time. Mrs. Crawford happily offered to watch the baby during school hours, and Grace found that she had missed the classroom more than she realized. Her students were delighted to have her back, and they all wanted to see baby Daniel and tell her about everything she had missed. Life settled into a comfortable pattern over the next few years. Daniel grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler who loved following his father around the ranch and listening to his mother read stories. When he was 3, Grace became pregnant again, and the following spring they welcomed a daughter they named Sarah Grace Lawrence. She had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's easy smile, and Daniel was immediately protective of his little sister. Vincent's dream of owning his own land came true when he was 30, 5 years after he had first arrived in Green River. Douglas Montgomery, who had come to think of Vincent almost as a son, sold him 300 acres of prime grazing land at a fair price and helped him stock it with quality cattle. Vincent built a larger house on the property, one with enough room for their growing family and the children he and Grace hoped would come in the future. Grace continued teaching, though she reduced her hours even further to spend more time with her children. She had developed a reputation as one of the finest educators in Wyoming, and parents from neighboring towns sometimes sent their children to board in Green River just so they could attend her classes. She took pride in this recognition, but never let it overshadow what was most important: her family. When Grace was 30, she gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas. The birth was easier than the first two, and the baby was calm and content from the start, rarely crying and sleeping through the night almost immediately. Daniel and Sarah adored their little brother, fighting over who got to hold him and help take care of him. Vincent's ranch prospered over the years. He had a gift for breeding cattle and an instinct for the market that served him well. He hired several hands to help with the work, treating them fairly and with respect, just as Douglas Montgomery had treated him. People in Green River spoke highly of Vincent Lawrence, noting how he had come to town as a drifter and become one of their most respected citizens. But Vincent never forgot where he had come from or how quickly circumstances could change. He was generous with his success, helping neighbors when they faced hard times, donating to the church and school, and serving on the town council. And he never, ever took for granted the incredible gift that Grace had given him: a family, a home, a life worth living. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent and Grace left the children with Mrs. Crawford, who was now in her 70s but still spry and delighted to watch her honorary grandchildren. Vincent took Grace riding out to the meadow where they had gone on one of their first dates, the place where wildflowers grew so thick you could not see the ground. It was summer, and the meadow was in full bloom. Vincent spread a blanket on the ground, and they sat together watching the sun move across the sky while they talked about everything they had experienced in the past decade. The joys and challenges, the fears and triumphs, the ordinary moments that made up a life. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked at one point. "Giving up the wandering life to settle down here?" Vincent pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Not for a single second." "Grace, that night in the alley when I found you surrounded by those men, I thought I was just doing what any decent person would do. I had no idea that I was actually finding my future. You and our children are the best things that have ever happened to me. I would live this life 1,000 times over if it meant having you by my side." Grace turned in his arms, kissing him with all the love and passion that 10 years of marriage had only deepened. "I love you, Vincent Lawrence. Thank you for saving me that day. Not just from those men, but from a life of loneliness and compromise. You gave me everything I did not even know I was looking for." "We saved each other," Vincent said, "and we are going to keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They stayed in the meadow until the stars came out, holding each other and talking about their dreams for the future. They wanted more children if they were blessed with them. They wanted to see Daniel, Sarah, and Thomas grow up healthy and happy. They wanted to grow old together, watching their grandchildren play in the same meadow where they now lay. As the years continued to pass, those dreams came true one by one. Grace had 2 more children, twin girls they named Emma and Elizabeth, who kept the entire household in cheerful chaos with their matching mischief. Daniel grew into a young man who loved ranching as much as his father did, and Vincent began teaching him everything he knew about managing cattle and land. Sarah discovered a passion for teaching like her mother and began helping in the schoolhouse as soon as she was old enough. Thomas showed an aptitude for numbers and business that suggested he might one day expand the family's holdings even further. Vincent and Grace watched their children grow with pride and joy, marveling at how each one had their own personality and dreams. They supported those dreams, even when they took the children in unexpected directions. When Daniel announced at 20 that he wanted to try his hand at horse breeding in addition to cattle ranching, Vincent gave him a section of land and his blessing. When Sarah decided to attend teachers' college in Cheyenne, Grace helped her prepare and cried tears of pride at her graduation. Through it all, Vincent and Grace's love for each other never wavered. They had their disagreements and challenges, as any married couple did. There were hard years when drought threatened the ranch, when illnesses swept through the family, when loss touched their lives. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and from the foundation of love and respect they had built. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a huge celebration. Nearly everyone in Green River attended, filling the church and spilling out into the yard. People stood up one after another to talk about what Vincent and Grace Lawrence meant to the community, how their example of love and dedication had inspired others, how they had made Green River a better place simply by being themselves. Vincent and Grace stood together through all the speeches and toasts, their hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. When it was finally their turn to speak, Vincent could barely get the words out. 25 years ago, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I was a drifter with no home and no future. Then I heard a commotion in an alley, and I met the woman who would change everything. Grace, you took a broken, wandering man and gave him reasons to stay. You gave me a home, a family, and a love I never dreamed I deserved. Every day with you has been a gift, and I look forward to spending every remaining day I have by your side. Grace kissed him in front of the entire town, not caring who saw. You saved my life that day in the alley, she said. But more than that, you taught me what love really means. It is not just passion or romance, though we have had plenty of both. It is partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day. It is building something together that is greater than either of us could have built alone. Vincent, you are my hero, my love, and my best friend. Here is to another 25 years together. The celebration lasted late into the night with dancing and music and laughter. Their children danced with them, and their grandchildren, though still young, joined in the festivities with enthusiastic, clumsy attempts. Vincent and Grace moved through it all in a happy daze, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect. When they finally returned home, exhausted but content, they stood on the porch of the ranch house they had built together. The house was quiet now, the children having grown and moved into their own homes on various parts of the property. But it did not feel empty. It felt like a life well lived, full of memories and love. "You remember that first night?" Grace asked, leaning against Vincent's chest as they looked out over the land. "When you walked me back to Mrs. Crawford's boarding house and asked if you would see me again?" "I remember every moment," Vincent replied, wrapping his arms around her. "I remember thinking that you were the most beautiful, most courageous woman I had ever met. I remember hoping you would give me a chance even though I had nothing to offer but a battered heart and willing hands." "You had everything I needed," Grace said. "You still do." They stood there until the moon rose high in the sky, content in the silence and in each other's presence. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch or a large family, but a legacy of love and integrity that would outlive them both. Years continued to pass, bringing with them the joys and sorrows of life. Vincent's hair turned silver, and Grace's face developed the lines that came from decades of smiling. They became grandparents many times over, and eventually great-grandparents. They watched Green River grow from a small railroad town into a thriving city. They saw automobiles replace horses on Main Street, electricity come to rural areas, and the world change in ways they never could have imagined when they were young. Through it all, they remained each other's constant. Vincent still looked at Grace with the same love and admiration he had felt when he first saw her standing terrified in that alley. Grace still felt her heart skip when Vincent smiled at her in that special way that was hers alone. They held hands when they walked, kissed each other goodbye every morning, and fell asleep in each other's arms every night. On a warm summer evening when Vincent was 68 and Grace was 65, they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Their children and grandchildren had just left after a large family dinner, and the house was quiet again. "You know what I am most grateful for?" Grace asked, her head resting on Vincent's shoulder. "What is that, my love?" "That those men cornered me in that alley all those years ago." "Is it terrible to be grateful for something so frightening?" Vincent chuckled softly. "I understand what you mean. If that had not happened, I might have ridden right through Green River and never looked back. I would have missed out on the best 43 years of my life." 43 years of marriage and a lifetime of love," Grace said. "Who would have thought that a violent encounter could lead to something so beautiful?" "God works in mysterious ways," Vincent replied. "Or maybe it was just fate. Either way, I thank whatever force brought us together every single day." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars began to emerge. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and the soft sound of a creek flowing. These were the sounds of home, the soundtrack of the life they had built. Grace knew that their time together would not last forever. They were both getting older, and while they were still healthy and active, the years would eventually catch up with them. But she was not afraid of that ending, not when they had lived so fully and loved so completely. Whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. Vincent pressed a kiss to the top of Grace's head, and she snuggled closer to him. They had started their journey together in violence and fear, but they had transformed that beginning into something transcendent. They had proven that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that two broken people could come together and make each other whole. The story of the cowboy who saved the teacher in the alley had become something of a legend in Green River. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and heroism. Young people looked to Vincent and Grace as proof that true love existed. And Vincent and Grace themselves cherished it as the foundation of everything good in their lives. As they sat on that porch watching the stars emerge one by one, Vincent and Grace knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. They had found each other against impossible odds, had built a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, and had experienced a love that most people only dreamed about. And it had all started with 4 men in an alley, 2 gunshots that changed everything, and a cowboy who refused to let evil win. Vincent had saved Grace's life that day, but in doing so, he had also saved his own. They had rescued each other from loneliness and fear, from lives half-lived and dreams abandoned. Now, in the twilight of their years, they could look back with satisfaction and forward with hope. Their children were thriving, their grandchildren were growing strong and good, and the love they shared continued to burn as brightly as it had on that first day when Vincent had looked into Grace's frightened eyes and promised her safety. It had been a good life, a life worth living, and they had lived it together. That was all that mattered in the end. Not the violence that had brought them together or the challenges they had faced, but the love they had chosen every single day for more than 4 decades. As the last light faded from the sky and the moon rose full and bright over the Wyoming landscape, Vincent and Grace Lawrence sat together on their porch, hands clasped, hearts full, grateful for every moment they had been given and ready for whatever the future held, knowing that as long as they had each other, they had everything they needed. Their love story had begun with gunfire and fear, but it had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of courage, kindness, and choosing to see the possibility of love even in the darkest moments. And in the small town of Green River, Wyoming, their story would be told for generations to come, inspiring others to believe in the transformative power of love and the heroism that exists in ordinary people who choose to do the right thing, even when it is hard. Vincent and Grace Lawrence had lived a life of purpose and passion, building something meaningful that would outlast them both. And as they sat together under the stars, they knew with absolute certainty that if they had to do it all over again, they would not change a single thing. Every moment had been worth it, every challenge overcome, every joy celebrated, all leading to this perfect moment of peace and contentment in each other's arms. Their story had a happy ending because they had worked every day to make it so, choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over everything else. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind.